So, second on the list, learn more about transitional encampments, and this is really from the perspective of siting and operational standards, and then also what other communities have done to build their programs and really learn through that process of community engagement and buy-in as they've developed, like this, for instance, the City of Seattle, as they've developed these ordinances that are now in place. So on March 1st and 6th and 11th, I met with Brent Adams, who's here tonight, who has been a strong proponent of sanctuary camps and now transitional encampments, to really understand program out model, citing performance metrics, and I've invited him tonight to talk about those things, and so I'm going to yield the microphone to Mr. Adams, who's here up in the front, and he'll take a few minutes to go through his slides and really trying to orient the council to what really we're talking about as it relates to transitional encampments.
Mayor and Council, thank you, Vice Mayor. Some of you who've been following along might realize how landmark this is. I want to thank Drew Glover and the signees, Kristen Crone and Susie Brown, especially Susie for really doing this deep dive and leading great work on this. Also, very proud of this, this city government for taking this on. So I'm not going to give an anecdote, but I've been traveling to the transitional encampments for many years, since 2012. And the reason I become an adherent of them is because I watch them as sort of maybe renegade-looking encampments on church properties, and I kept going year after year to watch them build up to the point where they're actually part of the city structure of Seattle and Eugene now. And you'll see them year after year getting bigger to the point where they were had to move around every 3 months, and now finally they can stay on city property year-round. So just watching every year the ordinance changes and watch the beneficial nature to the point where now those tent camps are beginning to become tiny house villages. And it's just, I've been completely committed, watching people grow and then watching the data as people move out of these programs. So, of course, a lot of what I'm doing here is a little bit redundant, but it's actually from kind of what I see the nonprofits up there doing. This is not necessarily all part of the ordinance or what you're deciding on, but it's kind of what we see, what we brought together as the sanctuary camp model. What are the most successful programs up there? What are those nonprofits? How are those programs designed from the operator standpoint? So as I see it, Transitional Encampment is a city or county permitted nonprofit operated community of soft shelter rigid structures on private or public land with food preparation and meeting spaces, an in-camp government structure, and community outreach program. Now the hallmarks, and these are a little mind-blowing for me, and which is why I'm so committed to them. People transition to better circumstances at a higher rate out of these transitional encampments, and I'm happy to show data a little bit later. Most cost-efficient sheltering model, and I really want you to ask yourself about the bang for the buck. What are we paying for even when programs are putting people on the pathway to housing? What is the cost breakdown per person, especially when you take a program wide and how many people actually did get into housing? So we should really be that critical now. No increase in crime wherever they're located. That's really controversial, but the way that happens is it creates community within the population as well as it strengthens the larger community. And that's really one of the ways that crime is not increasing, actually decreases. Also, promotes interpersonal healing for all the residents inside. So there's some quotes from the Permanent Encampment Evaluation Report from the City of Seattle, dated June 28th. Of 2017. Here's a quote. Seattle Police Department has been collecting data and information about the levels of crime that occur around the permanent encampments. This data shows that there is no significant increase in crime. And that is really, that's ridiculously important to put a pin in. So the agreements, again, this is for the people who are in the encampment, the residents. We call them rules. One of the most common is that these camps have allowed the residents within the encampment to engage in volunteer service rather than hiring out or having paid staff for all of the elements. Every resident would do 10 hours of service per week within the program. Think downtown streets team, only maybe cheaper with an encampment model. Imagine people walking around the neighborhood with a orange vest and a flashlight, a clipboard, or a garbage cleaner upper. And so that actually communicates to the neighborhood that these people are taking care of the neighborhood. That's how, and also people staff the front gate, keep things clean in the kitchen, and really keep the place tidy and well operating. Of course, no drug, alcohol use, no weapons, no violence, no theft. That can be a those are often no zero tolerance elements, no aggressive behavior, all the way down to the end. And people must participate in a case management program. Here's a little quote here. Residents hold each other accountable for individual actions. A grievance procedure is used to resolve conflicts. Some suggested resident criteria, and this is really important to my mind, a 3-tier admittance for access to this. For instance, some of these encampments that we've seen locally, people move from out of the area when they hear it, or they see it on the news. It should always be stated that for a transitional encampment, it's for the people who are here. If we're going to engage in this sort of thing, we're not trying to put the welcome mat for people to come from out of the area. In fact, that's one of the reasons that some of these encampments have failed in years past, for instance, in Placerville, because it went out on the news that there's this camp. So you really want to take care of the population who are local here. Of 1 month trial period, here we have 1 month, 6 months, 3 months. By the 3 month, you're really trying to help people transition into a better space. If requested, residents must comply with the background check or urinalysis. That's not normally a factor, but if you're having problems with drug, alcohol within the camp, that's a really strong conversation to have. Basic infrastructure, a lot of these things are in the thing before you, a camp management plan. I'll scale all the way down to tents on platforms with rain shedding. Now this is the most basic shelter concept. Of course it's our camping tent, but that's not really good enough over time. You need it up on a metal platform with something that's going to shed water away from it. So water and sun really are never affecting it. That you could have a much longer life. Food preparation, that's really important. In fact, in all communities, in all our houses, our community is, our homes are located around the hearth. People sharing food with one another. That's one of the most healing community things that can happen. We want to make sure that people are able to share food, that if we have EBT cards or people want to bring food into the space, that's not off to the corner, that's right fixed in the middle. Of course, meeting areas. Because there's one of the requirements for most of these transitional encampments up north are regular in-camp meetings. Also front desk, that's critical. People, people shouldn't be able to just kind of waltz in. There's a 24-hour gate there with usually a volunteer there 24 hours a day to make sure that people can't just come in, or somebody with a camera. During business hours, people can come in with a guide and take a tour. Next slide. So the operator, that's in this case a nonprofit or a church in in-camp governance. So the nonprofit or faith community, whoever's going to apply for this permit, would in a transitional encampment affirms the agreements that we just listed earlier. Affirm the agreement enforcement. How do you enforce rules? And a lot of that is, some of those are really easy. For instance, if you have like a handle of vodka or a syringe, that's going to flag, and the nonprofit's going to have a meeting with this person. But if it's violence or theft or something like that, that's a zero tolerance moment. It has to be addressed immediately. The nonprofit can work with the camp residents in this manner. Also, all the way down, provides on-site manager, including, that could be a camp resident, but there's always management happening 24 hours a day. There's always a responsible person on duty. It's never just kind of opened to the whims of people. In-camp community meetings. Now this is really important, where people have some say in their community. You hear a lot of these transitional encampments are kind of like it's self-managed. They're not really self-managed to the point where they can just move it down the street, or these in-camp meetings are usually consensus-based. For instance, in most community houses, we do have weekly meetings, monthly meetings. This is really to talk about social issues or how to deal with camp problems within the camp. It also allows them to have a representation so they can bring it to some of this community advisor committee or the city, or how to interact with the nonprofit. The casework program, this is really key in actually the success hallmarks, is that, yeah, people are there, but how do you benefit them? How do they move from one place to another, when they're moving to a better space when they exit the encampment? So target goals, and this would actually be professional staff. Some of these encampments use college interns to help manage this, but we're focusing on housing, sobriety, education, employment opportunities, and mental and physical health. But it really gets people working towards attainable goals. That's really important. Also, improving the circumstances when it's time for them to move out of the encampment. Operator responsibilities is the nonprofit responsibilities. Lee mentioned community outreach meetings and community advisory committee. Before you site locate any of this into a neighborhood, you just want to plunk this down on a city property without meeting with the neighborhood first. So I think that's actually in the plan that you're looking at. But it's really important to bring the community in, to have them and also see clearly what's being proposed. But there would also be individuals from the neighborhood around who are from stakeholder groups in the advisory committee. So you have, it's like a bicameral governance, that there are meetings within the camp, meetings outside of the camp, and sometimes you get together and have a larger meeting. All the way down, data collection. This is really important, in fact, to show efficacy. And this is one of the reasons I'm most committed to this, because we're watching people move out of homelessness through these. So you have entrance data coming in, exit data, and then data about case management. Here's another quote. The governance management model creates shared power and decision-making structure where residents participate in the adoption and enforcement of policy, assist with security and property maintenance, and share the experience and expertise with their peers. There's a mentoring that can go on. Here's some data. This is from, you'll see to the right there, source reports from the Eugene City Manager's Office, 2017, also from City of Washington. They have a permitted encampment evaluation that came out in 2017. This is about data that they produced in 2016. I think this is really critical. In fact, when we look at that, so you'll see the blue and the red there, Seattle and Eugene, so those are different sets of data. Eugene only has the exit data, but Seattle has some intake data there. I think it's really critical to note that people are, they're coming in from the street or from the shelter. Those are the large numbers there under Seattle intake, and they're exiting in the next column largely to permanent housing and transitional housing. They're not going back into a shelter or largely back onto the street. So highly beneficial here. Also Eugene, look, they're exiting largely into permanent housing. Also down to this, to the right here, so I'm talking about bang for the buck for a program like this. It says cost per person exited from the program. And these are yearly totals. So it only cost $2,300 essentially per person. In the city of Seattle, it was paying about 85% of those budgets. And the next one is the cost per person exiting to permanent supported housing, permanent housing. So the number of people that year who exited to housing divided by the cost of the program. And I think that's a really good bang for the buck. When you think about the cost of programs and how many people are actually moving into housing, we talk about permanent supported housing, housing first quite a bit, and programs want to put people on the pathway to housing. Here's a real good example of a program that is doing that and that the cost is in line. It's a little, with something that's a little more sane. Last slide. So it's really important too, if we're going to do this, this is a novel approach, of course, it's a little controversial, but I've seen dozens of these up in the Northwest, so I'm wondering, how can we have something so effervescent and perfect in Santa Cruz? One way is through community acceptance. Of course, it's through these resident and neighborhood outreach meetings. Of course, I direct the storage program operated by the Warming Center, and we had some neighborhood meetings, some meetings with the neighborhood tenants, lots of meetings with the landlord prior to citing that, and that's really why we've been so successful. So in an encampment like this, you really want to have the neighborhood engaged. Also, the community advisory committee that we mentioned earlier, is that the neighborhood stakeholders become a little bit responsible for the success also. Hallmarks, let's revisit those. People transition to a better circumstances at a higher rate. We've seen that now. It's most cost-effective sheltering model, especially when you're talking about large shelters. No increase in crime wherever they're located. It creates community within as it strengthens the larger community and promotes interpersonal healing. So what we're proposing is a pilot camp to start with. Of course, there's a longer track that's being proposed, a permitted, how to get something that's a permitted and a certified transitional encampment. But what about first a pilot camp project to show the beneficial nature that can produce data right up from the beginning? Now, Seattle and Eugene had some timelines of acceptance. They started small. They could only be in a space for 9 months, and finally they can be there all year round. They could only be in certain areas of the city. Now they can be in any area of the city. So they really built from something small. But do you want to do that in Santa Cruz also? Start with a pilot project. So this is a very innovative approach. So let's be cautious and measured, and start with some community input. Have some of these community meetings. And thanks for the time. I appreciate it.